My mother's voice carried the particular warmth she reserved for audiences. These, she said, lifting the first box from the arrangement she had spent 3 days constructing, are for the grandchildren who made us proud. I watched her hand a cobalt blue wrapped package tied with a French grosgrain ribbon to my sister Denise's oldest. Then another. Then a third. My children, Chloe and Marcus, sat across the table with the particular stillness of children who have learned, early and without being taught in words, that waiting is sometimes the entire punishment. My name is Callista Vane. I am 47 years old, and I had been sitting at that table in one version or another for 43 of those years. I did not move. I did not speak. I placed my fork with deliberate precision against the rim of my plate and observed the way my mother's shoulders settled with satisfaction, the way the gesture landed in her body like a task finally completed. Chloe looked at me, not at the table, not at her empty place. At me. The question in her 9-year-old face was not anger, it was calibration. She was trying to understand what the correct response was, because in 9 years she had already learned that the adults around her defined the emotional weather. I smiled at her. Small, steady. The smile said, "We are fine, we are whole, and none of what is happening here belongs to us." Then my sister Denise laughed. It was not a cruel laugh in the theatrical sense. It was worse than that. It was a comfortable laugh, the laugh of a woman who has never once questioned whether the floor beneath her was stable, because in this family, it was always built specifically for her weight. "Guess they didn't earn one," she said. I did not flinch. I did not look at her. I lifted my water glass and took a slow, measured sip, and in the half second that the glass was still in front of my face, I observed her with the clarity of someone who has finally, stopped hoping for a different version of a person. She was not monstrous. That was the thing people would never understand. She was comfortable. Comfort in the wrong architecture is its own form of cruelty. My father nodded. He did not say anything. He never said anything, which was its own kind of language, when I had been translating for 4 decades with diminishing hope that I had misread the original text. I set the glass down. I looked at Marcus, 11 years old, who was staring at the tablecloth with the focused attention of a child who has decided that if he does not look at the thing cannot fully exist. I stood up. I did not push the chair back dramatically. I did not make a sound that required an explanation. I stood the way I had taught myself to do everything in that house over the last several years, which was with the contained energy of someone who has already made the decision and is simply now executing it. "Get your coats," I said to my children, quietly. "The way you say something when it is not a request." My mother said my name, once, with that particular shape of shock that is less about the other person and more about the disruption of an expected pattern. I did not respond to my name. We walked to the door. I gathered Marcus's jacket from the hook in the hallway, the one shaped like an antler that my father had installed 15 years ago and had always irritated me in ways I could never fully articulate until now, when I understood that the irritation had never been about the hook. I opened the door. The November air was sharp and clean and entirely indifferent to everything that had just happened inside that house, which I found in that moment to be one of the most comforting things I had ever felt. In the car, Chloe asked me where we were going. "Home," I said. "Are we coming back?" I looked at her in the rearview mirror for exactly 1 second. "No," I said. Marcus did not ask anything. He looked out the window. He had, I realized with a grief that I stored carefully and did not allow to move through me in that moment, already understood the answer before his sister asked the question. At a red light, I took out my phone. I typed 11 words and sent them before the light changed. "Don't invite us again, we're not your joke." Then I added 4 more. "Your gift is coming." Then I put my phone face down on the passenger seat and drove my children home through the dark, and the three of us were quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are not sad, but are instead in the process of becoming something different than what they were an hour ago. The calls started at 7:53 in the evening. My mother first, then my father, then Denise. I let every single one roll to voicemail, not because I was afraid of what they would say, because I already knew what they would say, and for the first time in 43 years, what they said had no mechanism to reach me. If you have ever sat at a table surrounded by people who share your blood and realized, in a single crystalline moment, that you have been auditioning for a role they already decided you would never be cast in, then you understand exactly what was moving through me on that drive home. If you have ever watched your children be quietly measured and found wanting by the very people who were supposed to love them without conditions, by the people who should have known their names and their specific laugh, and the particular way they tilt their heads when they are thinking hard about something, and instead saw only a comparison that your children could never win, because the competition was never actually about your children at all, then I need you to stay with me. Because what I am about to tell you is not a story about revenge in the way people mean when they use that word as something hot and immediate and satisfying in a cheap way. This is a story about the slow, precise, surgical reclamation of a life that was being dismantled by people who were so certain of their own permanence that they never once considered I might be paying attention. I have been paying attention for 6 years. I have been documenting, organizing, cross referencing, and building something they could not see because they never believed I was capable of building anything at all. If that is the kind of story you are here for, stay with me, because part two is where the architecture becomes visible. Now, let me take you back to how this nightmare started. The house my parents live in sits on a cul-de-sac in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, where the landscaping is maintained with the seriousness of a professional reputation, and the neighbors notice when your gutters need cleaning. My parents have lived there for 29 years. My father, Gerald Vane, retired from a 31-year career in municipal bond oversight and serves on the board of his church, and is a member of the Harrowfield Country Club, which has a waiting list and a dress code, and a particular social gravity that my father has organized significant portions of his identity around. My mother, Patricia Vane, was a homeroom coordinator for the local school district for 22 years before she retired, which meant she had spent 2 decades being the person who knew every family's business, without being the person anyone thought to be careful around. She has a gift for making herself seem less than she is in rooms where seeming less gives her more access. I did not understand this about her until I was 38 years old, which is, I will tell you plainly, much later than I should have. My sister Denise is 4 years younger than me and has, as far as I can identify, never in her adult life experienced the specific anxiety of not being wanted in a room. She is fluent in the social language of our parents' world in a way I was not because I lacked the intelligence for it, but because I had, in my 20s, made the particular mistake of marrying a man my parents found aesthetically inconvenient. His name was Raymond, and he was a good man, and the marriage ended not because of anything dramatic, but because we had built something in our early 20s that neither of us knew how to maintain into our mid 30s, and we made the mature and terrible decision to stop before we made each other permanently unhappy. We share Chloe and Marcus with a decency that I am still proud of. He has remarried. We are cordial. The children move between us without trauma. My parents, however, never divorced Raymond in the abstract. They kept him as evidence, a piece of documentation they could hold up, subtly and then less subtly, as proof of a judgment I had exhibited at 24 that explained every subsequent thing about me that they found disappointing. When I arrived at family events in my early 40s, I was still arriving as the woman who had made that choice. The gray wool blazer I wore for the first 3 years of those gatherings, the one with the loose button on the left cuff that I kept meaning to repair, was not a fashion statement. It was the visual confirmation of what they expected to see, and I wore it without understanding that I was, in some architectural way, providing them the costume they needed me to wear. I understand it now. Those 6 years of dinners and holidays and birthday gatherings where I sat at the left end of the table, the seat nearest the kitchen, the seat that required me to get up 3 times per meal to help with serving while Denise remained seated and was thanked elaborately for bringing the store-bought pie, those years were not random. They were a system. And systems, once you understand their internal logic, become navigable in ways their architects never anticipate. It was my uncle Philip who first said it out loud. Philip is my father's younger brother, and in the family taxonomy, he occupies the category of lovable disaster, the man whose divorce was messier than mine, whose accounting business had some years that were better than other years, whose laugh is too loud, and whose opinions about local politics are shared with the conviction of someone who has given the matter significant personal study. The family manages him the way you manage a piece of furniture that does not match the room, but has been there so long that removing it would require an explanation. At a birthday dinner for my father, 4 years ago this past February, Philip sat down next to me with a plate of food and a glass of bourbon, and said without preamble, without looking at me, in the low, conversational tone of someone delivering a weather report, "They moved the account, the family account. Switched the beneficiary structure, did it last spring?" I looked at him. "Your father didn't tell you," he said. It was not a question. "No," I said. He nodded. "He ate a forkful of something." "Figured," he said. And then Denise called across the room to him about something related to the garage sale she was organizing. And Philip went back to his dinner, and the conversation was over in under 90 seconds. And I sat with what he had said the way you sit with a small injury that you need to assess before you understand its severity. That night, in my car before I started the engine, I opened the notes application on my phone and I typed 3 sentences. The date, what Philip had said, and what it might mean. That was the beginning of the file. What Philip had not known, or perhaps had known but chosen not to detail, was that the account he was referencing was not simply a household savings account. My parents had established, during my grandmother's final years, a jointly structured family preservation fund, which was a specific financial instrument their estate attorney, a man named Lawrence Beaumont who had offices on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and whose business card was printed on stock so heavy it felt like a small statement, had set up in 2014 to facilitate the organized transfer of my grandmother's estate. My grandmother, Eleanor Vane, had left a total estate valued at $412,000.33. I know this number with the precision of someone who reviewed the original estate summary document that my grandmother herself had mailed to me in an envelope with a handwritten note on the inside flap that said simply, "So you know." I had that envelope. I had kept it in a manila folder at the back of a filing cabinet in my home office, beneath a stack of Marcus's early school artwork, for 6 years. $412,000.33. The specificity of that number, the 33 cents that represented some final accounting of my grandmother's accumulated life, had stayed with me as a kind of anchor in the years that followed. The fund had been structured with 3 named beneficiaries: my father, myself, and Denise, in equal thirds. My grandmother had been specific about this. She had said so to me personally, over the telephone, 3 weeks before her stroke, in a conversation that I had not fully understood at the time as the significant transmission it was. She had wanted to correct something. I believe now that she saw the system her son had built and was using the only tool she had left to push against it. What Philip had dropped into our 90-second conversation at my father's birthday dinner was that the beneficiary structure had been altered. I did not know yet what the alteration was. I did not know who had altered it, or when the legal paperwork had been completed, or whether what had been done was within the bounds of what the instrument allowed. What I did know, sitting in my car in my parents' driveway in the February cold, was that I needed to find out, and that I needed to find out quietly, and that I needed someone whose professional understanding of estate structures exceeded my own. Her name was Margaret Chu. She was a forensic estate attorney with a practice in a converted Victorian building 12 blocks from where I worked, and she had been recommended to me 2 years earlier by a colleague who had used her services during a particularly complicated inheritance dispute with a stepfamily. I had kept her card in my wallet, in the narrow slot behind my health insurance card, because something had told me at the time that I might need it, though I had not known for what. The card was made of matte white stock with her name in a simple serif font, and in the upper left corner was a very small embossed image of a balanced scale. I had looked at it occasionally over those 2 years without taking it out. The Monday after Philip's comment, I called the number on the card and made an appointment. I did not tell anyone I was making the appointment. Not Philip, not my ex-husband Raymond, not the friend who had originally recommended her. This was the first discipline I imposed on myself, and it was the discipline that made every subsequent thing possible. When you are building something in secret, the secrecy is not paranoia. It is structure. It is the load-bearing wall of the entire project. Margaret Chu was 61 years old and had the particular manner of someone who had spent 3 decades in rooms where people were lying to her and had developed a nearly physiological radar for the specific texture of truth versus performance. She sat across from me at a desk of dark walnut with a surface so clear it suggested a professional philosophy, and she listened to everything I said without writing anything down, which I later understood was because she was listening for the shape of the situation rather than its details. When I finished, she was quiet for approximately 12 seconds. "Do you have the original instrument documents?" she asked. "I have a summary document my grandmother sent me," I said. "I believe the originals are with your colleague Lawrence Beaumont." Something shifted in her expression, not dramatically. A small recalibration, the kind that happens when a detail lands that has weight. "Lawrence Beaumont retired 14 months ago," she said. "His practice was absorbed by a larger firm downtown. There was a transition period of approximately 5 months during which a significant number of client documents were in transit between offices." She let that sit. "That timing," I said. "Yes," she said. "That timing." I did not need her to complete the sentence. I had already completed it, somewhere in the part of my mind that had been quietly completing sentences for 6 years while I smiled across dinner tables and passed the serving dishes and wore the gray wool blazer with the loose button. The documentation trail I began building that week was not dramatic, it was methodical. It was the careful, systematic accumulation of every piece of evidence that a life of careful dismissal leaves behind when the people doing the dismissing have never once considered that you were watching. I began with what I had. The envelope from my grandmother, still in its original condition, with the postmark and the handwritten note and the summary document inside. A document that listed, in a column of clean figures, the assets of the estate, including the gold Tiffany and Company, Elsa Peretti bone cuff bracelet that my grandmother had specified in a handwritten codicil, should pass to me, valued at the time of the document at $2,140. A piece I had never received and had never asked about, because asking had felt, in the architecture of my family, like the kind of statement that confirmed their version of who you were. I had my own financial records. 6 years of them, organized in a system I had developed in the months after Philip's comment at the birthday dinner. Every transaction, every holiday expense, every cost absorbed silently during family events where I had brought food and wine and my labor, and received, in return, the left seat by the kitchen, and the understanding that this was simply how the table was arranged. I had the voicemails. 17 of them, saved and timestamped, from the previous 4 years, in which my mother's voice described plans and events and family decisions in which I was not included, voicemails that had been sent to me not as invitations, but as announcements, the tonal difference between which I had only fully begun to understand when Margaret Chu explained to me the legal significance of documented exclusion in certain estate challenge proceedings. And I had Philip. Philip, who did not know he was an asset, who thought he was simply a man who had said something at a birthday dinner, because the bourbon and the general unfairness of things had loosened his mouth at the right moment. Philip was the living, speaking, breathing corroboration of a conversation that I had immediately documented and timestamped. I did not contact him again after that night. I did not ask him follow-up questions. I did not tip him off that I was building something. I let him remain in his family position as the lovable disaster, the furniture that didn't match, because his value to me was precisely his uncontaminated status as someone with no apparent stake in what I was doing. Over the following months, the documentation grew. Margaret Chu directed me with surgical efficiency. She told me what to look for and how to request it, and what my legal standing was in requesting it. And she said it all in the calm, practical language of someone for whom other people's family crises are a professional specialty rather than an emotional event. She told me that if the beneficiary structure had been altered on an instrument that had three named beneficiaries, all three of those beneficiaries had specific and legally enforceable notification rights. She told me that certain alterations, made during a period when original documents were in professional transit, and therefore potentially less auditable, would raise specific questions about timing and intent. She told me that documentation, consistent and time-stamped and contemporaneous, was the most durable form of evidence in estate proceedings. Not because courts were sentimental, but because contemporaneous documentation demonstrates something that retroactive claims cannot replicate, which is the fact of knowledge at the time. She told me this while looking at the envelope my grandmother had sent me at the postmark, at the handwriting on the inside flap. Your grandmother knew something, Margaret Chu said. Yes, I said, I think she did. She sent this to you specifically. She did. Margaret Chu placed the envelope carefully on her clear walnut desk and looked at it for a moment with an expression I can only describe as professional respect. Keep this exactly as it is, she said. In the condition it is in right now. Do not unfold the document again. Store it in an acid-free sleeve. I went to an archival supply store that same afternoon and bought a package of acid-free document sleeves, each one crystal clear and sealed with a gentle pressure mechanism rather than an adhesive that might degrade. They came in a package of 20 and cost $11.72. I placed my grandmother's envelope in the first sleeve and the rest of the package in the back of my filing cabinet, and I understood, as I did it, that I was not being dramatic. I was being meticulous. And meticulous, in the right circumstances, is the most powerful thing a person can be. The Thanksgiving dinner had not been the beginning of this story. It was the end of my willingness to let the story be told by someone else. I had been preparing for that moment for 3 years without knowing I was preparing for it. And when it arrived, when my sister laughed that comfortable laugh and my mother's face settled with satisfaction, and my daughter looked at me from across the table with her quiet, calibrating gaze, I understood that the preparation was complete. The gift I had referenced in those final 4 words of my text was not a physical object. It was something I had built over 6 years and 3 months, and several hundred hours of quiet, invisible, meticulous labor. With the help of a 61-year-old forensic estate attorney, whose business card was still in my wallet behind my health insurance card, and with the testimony of a document in an acid free archival sleeve, and with the unrealized cooperation of a man who thought he was just making small talk at a birthday dinner. They were calling my phone in a panic, my mother and my father and my sister, and they did not yet know specifically what I had sent. But they knew me well enough, or they thought they did, which was the particular beautiful irony of everything that happened next, because what they actually knew was the version of me that I had allowed them to see for 43 years, the woman in the gray blazer with the loose button, the woman in the left seat by the kitchen, the woman who absorbed and absorbed and absorbed without appearing to store anything at all. What they did not know was what I had become in the 6 years since a man with too much bourbon and a functional conscience had said 8 words to me at a dinner table. They were about to find out. The voicemails ran to 11 minutes and 43 seconds combined. I know because I timed them. Not immediately, not that night, but 3 days after Thanksgiving, when I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, and my phone propped against the fruit bowl, and I listened to every single one of them with the focused attention of a researcher reviewing primary source material, which is precisely what they were. My mother went first. Her voicemail was 4 minutes and 12 seconds, which told me everything I needed to know about the state of her composure, because my mother is a woman who believes that impact is inversely proportional to length, that the truly powerful statement is the short one, and 4 minutes meant that her calibration had failed her. She said my name 6 times. She used the phrase, "This is not who we are," twice. She did not once say the word sorry, but she constructed 3 separate sentences that were architecturally adjacent to an apology without committing to the load bearing wall of one, which was a rhetorical technique I had watched her use my entire life and had only recently learned to name. My father's voicemail was 58 seconds. This was almost exactly what I expected. He said he thought we should talk. He said he was sure there had been a misunderstanding. He said he hoped the kids were okay. The word misunderstanding was doing enormous structural work in that sentence, carrying the weight of an entire alternative version of the evening in which nothing deliberate had occurred, in which my sister's laughter had been ambient noise rather than punctuation, in which the arrangement of gift boxes by a woman who had spent 3 days constructing that arrangement had been somehow accidental. Denise's voicemail was 6 minutes and 33 seconds, which was longer than my mother's and which told a different story entirely. Denise was not panicking. Denise was negotiating. There is a distinction, and it matters. Panic is involuntary. Negotiation is strategic. Her 6 minutes and 33 seconds were the voicemail of a woman who understood. At some level, I had not previously given her credit for, that something had shifted in the architecture, and that the shifting required a response more calculated than our mother's 4 minutes of displaced emotion. She called me Cal 4 times, which is what she called me when she wanted something from me, as opposed to Callista, which was what she called me when she was performing family solidarity for an audience, as opposed to simply not using my name at all, which was her default register for most of our adult interactions. She said she didn't know what I had sent. She said she assumed it was something. She said she thought we should talk before anything got out of hand, which was an interesting phrase because it implied that hands were currently involved, that there was something in motion that could still be redirected by the application of the right kind of pressure in the right kind of place. She was not wrong about that. She was simply wrong about whose hands were on it. I finished my coffee. I made notes in the document I had been maintaining since the birthday dinner, a document now 114 pages long in its digital form, organized by date and category, and annotated with cross-references to supporting materials. I noted the timestamp of each voicemail, the number of times my name was used in each, the specific vocabulary of each, and what each vocabulary choice indicated about the speaker's awareness of what, precisely, they might be facing. Then I closed the document, rinsed my cup, and went to help Marcus with the history project he had due on Friday. This is what composure actually looks like, not the absence of feeling, not the performance of indifference. It is the capacity to place the feeling in its correct location in the sequence of things, to know that it will be addressed, and to therefore allow the present moment to be what the present moment needs to be, which on that particular morning was a conversation with an 11-year-old about the causes of the First World War. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, my parents called a family dinner. Not a holiday, not a birthday. A dinner framed in the invitation my mother sent, which she sent by email with the subject line, Important Family Discussion, as an opportunity for everyone to come together and clear the air. The email was addressed to me, to Denise, to Denise's husband Terrence, and to my uncle Philip, who had been included. I understood immediately because his presence would dilute the confrontational quality of the gathering and provide my parents with the cover of a larger audience for whatever they had decided to say. I looked at the email for approximately 90 seconds. Then I responded, "We'll be there." Not me, we. I included Chloe and Marcus in the RSVP deliberately because I wanted my parents to have to sit with the decision of whether to exclude them again in a context that was explicitly framed as a family reconciliation. I wanted that decision to cost them something, even if only the internal negotiation of making it. They did not respond to my RSVP to clarify whether the children were included or excluded, which was, itself, information. The dinner was set for the second Saturday of December, at 6 in the evening, at my parents' house. I spent the intervening 3 weeks doing nothing that would be visible to them and several things that would not be. I met with Margaret Chu twice. The first meeting was to review the documentation package she had assembled in response to my initial materials and her own research, which had now expanded to include a formal records request submitted to the firm that had absorbed Lawrence Beaumont's practice, a request that was entirely within my legal rights to submit, and that had, predictably, produced a response that was slower than it should have been and more carefully worded than it needed to be, which was itself a form of information. The second meeting was to discuss what she had found. What she had found was precise and clean, and had the particular quality of something that has been waiting, patiently, to be found. The beneficiary structure of the Family Preservation Fund had been amended 14 months after my grandmother's death. The amendment removed my name from the instrument and redistributed my designated third, $137,000.44, to a revised structure that named Denise as sole secondary beneficiary after my parents' lifetimes. The amendment had been executed during the 5-month window when Lawrence Beaumont's client files were in transit between his retired practice and the absorbing firm. It had been signed by my father as the primary account holder, countersigned by a notary whose license I could not immediately verify, and filed with the amended instrument rather than through the original estate attorney's office. It had not been sent to me. It had not been communicated to me. It had not, as far as Margaret Chu could establish in her initial review, been executed in compliance with the notification requirements for a three-beneficiary instrument of this specific structure. Margaret Chu placed the summary document on her clear walnut desk and looked at it the way she had looked at my grandmother's envelope, with that expression of focused professional respect. "This is workable," she said, 2 words. I had learned in our months of working together that Margaret Chu's brevity was proportional to her confidence. 4 minutes meant uncertainty. 2 words meant the opposite. "What's our timeline?" I asked. "The records request response will come within 60 days, she said. "When it does, we will know the exact date the amendment was filed and who witnessed it. Once we have that date, we can establish the notification window with precision." "And the codicil item," I said. She looked at me steadily. "The Tiffany and Company bone cuff, documented in your grandmother's handwritten codicil, valued at $2,140 at time of estate summary." She paused. "Do you know where it currently is?" I did. I had known for 3 years, because my sister had worn it to my father's 65th birthday party, on her left wrist, with a cream-colored blouse, and had accepted the compliment my mother paid it without a single flicker of anything that suggested she understood what she was wearing. "Yes," I said. Margaret Chu nodded once. "Document that," she said. "Date, location, witnesses present." I had already documented it. The entry was in the file, cross-referenced under the category I had labeled Physical Asset Displacement, dated to the evening of my father's birthday party, 3 years and 2 months before this conversation. I left Margaret Chu's office and drove to the archival supply store, where I had purchased the acid-free sleeves, and I bought a second package, because the documentation had grown, and the first package was nearly depleted, and I understood in a practical and non-dramatic way that the project was entering a new phase that would require additional materials. The second package cost $11.72, the same price as the first. I noted this in the file because I note everything, and because there is a particular quality of symmetry to a project that maintains its cost structure from inception to execution. I arrived at my parents' house on the second Saturday of December at 5:58 in the evening, 2 minutes early, which I had calculated would require them to open the door before they were fully prepared to receive me on their own terms. I had dressed with the same deliberateness I had been applying to everything for the past several months, not the gray wool blazer with the loose button. That blazer had been donated to a charity resale shop in October, the loose button still unrepaired, because I had decided that the most efficient way to retire a symbol was to remove it from the inventory entirely. What I wore instead was a deep emerald green wrap blouse in a matte silk fabric that moved with me rather than on me, paired with dark tailored trousers and low block heels in a cognac leather that had been polished to a mirror surface. My hair was arranged with the kind of precision that looks effortless and is not. My jewelry was minimal. One ring, my grandmother's, a thin gold band that she had worn on her right hand for 50 years and had given to me in person 2 years before she died, sliding it from her finger at the kitchen table while we drank tea and telling me that she wanted to see me wearing it while she could still see it. I wore it on my right hand. As she had worn it, I wanted it visible this evening. Not as a statement that would be legible to the room. As an anchor for myself, a piece of physical continuity with the woman who had mailed me an envelope with a handwritten note on the inside flap that said, "So you know." I rang the doorbell. My father opened the door. He looked at me with the specific expression of a man who has been managing a situation for 3 weeks and has arrived at a presentation of the management rather than the situation itself. He looked, in other words, controlled. He was wearing a collared shirt in a pale blue that my mother had certainly selected. His handshake grip, when he extended his hand to Marcus, had the deliberate warmth of a performance. "Glad you came," he said. I smiled. The smile said nothing except that I was present, which was all it needed to say. The house smelled of my mother's cooking, specifically the braised short rib dish she made for occasions she considered significant, which told me she had staged this dinner as a reconciliation event rather than a confrontation, which told me they had decided the optimal strategy was warmth rather than defensiveness. This was a reasonable strategic choice. It was also too late to matter. Denise and Terence were already there. Denise was wearing a silk blouse in a deep burgundy with gold earrings that fell to her collarbone, and a general presentation that communicated ease and investment, the look of a woman who has dressed for a dinner she expects to control. Terence shook my hand with the particular blankness of a man who has been briefed on the situation and has decided his role is neutral presence. Philip arrived 8 minutes after us, with a bottle of wine he'd selected with more care than usual and the slightly over-calibrated casualness of a man who knows something is happening, but has not been told what his role in it is. He embraced me, kissed Chloe on the top of her head, and told Marcus he'd grown 6 inches, which was an exaggeration by roughly 4 inches, but was offered with such genuine warmth that Marcus smiled in the involuntary way that genuine warmth produces. I watched Denise watch Philip greet me. Her face was still. In the way that stillness requires effort, we moved to the dining room. The table was set with the good dishes, the ones with the gold rim that came out for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and occasions my mother classified as worthy of the storage cabinet's upper shelf. There were candles. There was a floral arrangement in the center that my mother had assembled herself, white and cream flowers in a low vase, the kind of arrangement that signals peace rather than celebration. She had thought about this. Every element of this staging had been considered. I sat down, helped Chloe settle next to me, arranged Marcus on my other side, and placed my right hand flat on the table for a moment, feeling the cool linen beneath my palm, feeling the thin weight of my grandmother's gold ring against the fabric. Dinner was served. The short ribs were as good as they always were. My father poured wine. Philip made 3 jokes, 2 of which landed. Terence talked about a project at work. The children ate with the particular focused attention of young people who have been told to be on their best behavior and are executing this instruction with varying degrees of commitment. And then, after the plates had been cleared and before dessert was brought out, my mother set down her wine glass. She did it with the specific deliberateness of a woman who is about to say something she has rehearsed. The room's ambient noise adjusted, not dramatically. People finished their sentences. Philip set down his fork. Terence straightened almost imperceptibly. "We wanted to have everyone here," my mother began, "because I think there are some things that need to be said, and I think it's important that we say them as a family." She looked at me. Her voice had the quality of something carefully maintained at an even temperature. "Cal," Denise said, using the name she used when she wanted something, We know you were upset at Thanksgiving, and honestly, I think there may have been some things that didn't land the way they were intended. I looked at her. I said nothing. I held my wine glass by the stem and let my thumb rest against the base. The gifts, my mother said, with the tone of someone explaining a logical system to a person who has misread its function, were for the children who had done specific things this year that we wanted to acknowledge. Denise's kids had their recital, and Connor's science award, and we wanted to celebrate those particular things. Specific things, I said. It was the first time I had spoken since we sat down. Yes, my mother said. She met my eyes. That's all it was, Callista. It was about specific achievements. It wasn't about anything else. Guess they didn't earn one, Denise said, not as an apology, not as a recollection offered in the spirit of acknowledging harm. She said it the same way she had said it at Thanksgiving, the same register, the same comfort, as if repeating it in the context of this explanation transformed it from its original meaning into something merely descriptive. I did not set down my glass. I did not look away from her. I placed my thumb more deliberately against the base of the stem and felt the slight resistance of the crystal against my skin, and I observed, with the particular clarity of someone who has been documenting for 6 years, three things simultaneously. First, my mother had not flinched when Denise said it. There had been no small corrective movement, no quick intake of breath, no repositioning of her posture to indicate that the repetition of this phrase in this context was anything other than acceptable, which meant she had known Denise would say it, which meant it had been part of what was rehearsed. Second, my father was looking at a point approximately 6 inches to the left of my face, a technique I had watched him use throughout my life when he was present at something he wished to be positioned slightly outside of. Third, Philip's right hand, which had been resting on the table beside his wine glass, had moved very slightly inward toward his plate. A small contraction. The gesture of a man who has just heard something confirm what he suspected and is processing the confirmation. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not produce any of the responses the room was at some level calibrated to receive. I smiled, not warmly, not coldly. The specific smile of someone who has just received exactly the information they came for. I understand, I said. My mother's posture shifted fractionally toward relief. The relief of a woman who has delivered the difficult thing and received, in return, what appeared to be acceptance. Denise picked up her wine glass. My father moved his eyes from the point 6 inches to the left of my face back to my actual face. I'm glad we could clear the air, my mother said. So am I said. Dessert came out. My mother had made the spiced pear tart she made for family occasions she wanted to end on a note of warmth. Chloe, who had been quiet through the preceding exchange with a 9-year-old's perfect attunement to adult tension, accepted a slice with the focused relief of a child returning to solid ground. I ate my dessert. I answered questions when asked. I watched Philip watch me from across the table with the expression of a man trying to read a document written in a language he only partially speaks. At 7:41 in the evening, I excused myself to use the restroom. I walked down the hallway past the antler-shaped hook my father had installed 15 years ago, past the framed family photographs arranged in their long row on the cream-colored wall. Photographs in which the family's visual history was curated with the same precision my mother applied to everything. And I noted, as I had noted each time I walked this hallway in recent years, that the photograph from my wedding, the one that had hung in the third position from the window for 9 years, had been replaced at some point in the past 4 years with a photograph from Denise's husband's 40th birthday party. I did not stop to look at it. I continued to the small half bathroom at the end of the hall, went inside, closed the door, and took out my phone. I texted Philip, 4 words. Come out to my car. I ran the water for 30 seconds, dried my hands on the small guest towel, and went back down the hallway. In the living room, I paused to tell Chloe I would be back in a few minutes, that I had left something in the car. She nodded. Marcus looked up from his phone and looked back down. My mother called from the kitchen. Everything all right? Of course, I said. I went outside. The December air was the same sharp and indifferent quality it had been on Thanksgiving night, and I stood beside my car and breathed it in and felt the same thing I had felt then, which was the relief of a space that has no investment in the performance I had just completed. Philip came out 4 minutes later, his coat half buttoned, his breath visible in the cold. He stopped a few feet from me and looked at me with the expression he'd had at the dinner table when Denise said it. You recorded that, he said. I've been recording everything, I said, for 6 years. He was quiet for a moment. The account, he said, that's what this is about. Among other things, he looked out toward the street. A car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping briefly across the front of my parents' house. They changed it 2 months after Mom died, he said. I found out because Gerald mentioned it once and then acted like he hadn't said anything. You know how he does that. I know exactly how he does that. I didn't know if I should have said anything at the birthday thing. You should have, I said, and you did, even if you didn't know how much it mattered. He looked at me then with a directness that I had always liked about Philip, the quality that made him inconvenient in the family's social ecosystem, the quality that meant he could not be fully managed. He looked at me like a man taking stock of something he had underestimated. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I've already done it," I said. "I need one more thing from you, a formal statement. Written, notarized, describing what my father said to you about the account change when he said it and the specific words he used." Philip was quiet. "That's going to make things complicated," he said. "Yes," I said, "it is." Another car passed. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking with the repetitive mechanical urgency of an animal that has forgotten why it started. "She deserved better than what they did," Philip said. He was talking about my grandmother. "She did," I said, "and so did my kids." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man making a decision rather than acknowledging a statement. "Tell me what you need," he said. I took out my phone and pulled up the contact I had saved under the name M. Chu and turned the screen toward him so he could see the number. "This attorney," I said. "She'll reach out to you next week to schedule a time. All you have to do is tell her exactly what you told me at the birthday dinner. Exactly. In your own words, whatever you remember." He looked at the name on the screen. "She any good?" he asked. "She's the best I've ever seen," I said. He took a breath of cold air and let it out slowly. "Okay," he said. We went back inside separately, 2 minutes apart, the way people re-enter rooms when they have had a conversation they do not want to explain. My mother looked up when I came in and smiled with the residual warmth of a woman who believed the evening had gone according to plan. I smiled back. Over the following 6 days, 3 things happened in sequence, each of them quiet, each of them irreversible. The first was Margaret Chu's call to Philip, which he answered, and from which she produced a 12-page formal statement, notarized by a licensed notary whose credentials were impeccable, describing in precise and legally useful detail the specific conversation at my father's birthday dinner, the specific language my father had used regarding the account amendment, and the timeline that language implied. The second was the arrival of the record's request response from the firm that had absorbed Lawrence Beaumont's practice, which arrived not in 60 days, but in 31, possibly because Margaret Chu had a professional reputation that had a certain accelerating effect on institutional response times. The response confirmed the amendment date, 9 weeks after my grandmother's death, during the documented transit period of the original client files, executed without the legally required notification to all named beneficiaries. The third was a call I made from my car, parked in the lot outside the grocery store on a Wednesday evening, while the radio played something soft and unimportant. A call to a specific department at a specific regulatory agency, whose full name is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, an organization that maintains jurisdiction over certain categories of financial instrument management, and whose procedures for handling substantiated complaints about improper fiduciary conduct are thorough, documented, and entirely beyond the control of any individual who might prefer they were not. I described the situation to the person on the other end of the line in the calm, organized, sequential language of someone who has had her documentation reviewed by a forensic estate attorney and knows precisely what is relevant and what is not. I provided dates. I provided the instrument type. I provided the amendment date and the notification failure. I provided Margaret Chu's name and contact information as the supervising attorney on the matter. The person on the other end took notes. They described the next steps in the process. They confirmed my name and contact information. I thanked them, ended the call, and sat in the parking lot for one additional minute, listening to the radio and the ambient sound of a Wednesday evening in an ordinary December in an ordinary parking lot, and I thought about my grandmother sliding her ring from her finger at her kitchen table and saying she wanted to see me wearing it while she could still see it. Then I went inside and bought groceries for the week, and I came home and made dinner for my children, and we ate together at our own table, in our own house, with no left seat by the kitchen and no arrangement of boxes addressed to more deserving recipients, and no comfortable laughter cutting through the air like something sharp disguised as something soft. Marcus told me about a book he was reading for school. Chloe said she wanted to try out for the spring play. I listened to both of them with my full attention, which is the most reliable thing I know how to give. And when the dishes were done and the children were in their rooms, and the house was quiet, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the file, the 114 pages of dates and documentation and cross-reference materials, and I added the final entries for the evening, and I noted the regulatory call, and I noted the date, and I closed the document. In 31 days, my parents would receive a formal inquiry notification from a regulatory body, whose letterhead they would recognize, and whose processes they would have no mechanism to redirect, halt, or reframe, addressed to both of them by name, in an envelope that would arrive at the house on the cul-de-sac with the carefully maintained landscaping, and the neighbors who noticed when your gutters needed cleaning. On a morning when the mail carrier's visit would be entirely ordinary and entirely unremarkable, right up until the moment it was not. And they would sit down at the kitchen table, where my grandmother had slid the ring from her finger, and they would open that envelope. And they would understand, for the first time, that the woman they had seated by the kitchen for 6 years had not been absorbing. She had been building, and they had just sat down to the most elaborate family dinner of their lives, completely certain they had cleared the air, while the real conversation had already moved to rooms they did not know existed and could not enter. The envelope from the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority arrived on a Tuesday. I know this because Philip called me at 8:47 in the morning, which is when he walks to the end of his driveway to collect his mail, a habit he has maintained for 30 years because he believes, with the stubborn conviction of a man who distrusts digital notification systems, that physical mail deserves to be retrieved with physical presence. He did not call to tell me about his own mail. He called because he had driven past my parents' house that morning on his way to pick up a prescription, a route he takes every other week, and he had seen my mother standing at the mailbox with an envelope in her hand and an expression on her face that he described as the one she gets when something is wrong with the plumbing but the plumber is already inside. She was still standing there when I turned the corner, he said. How long did she stand there? I asked. Long enough that she didn't go back inside before I lost sight of her, he said. I thanked him and hung up and made a note in the file. Date, time, source, observation. 37 words. Then I poured a second cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table and allowed myself, for approximately 90 seconds, to feel the specific quiet satisfaction of a calibrated mechanism producing its expected output. 90 seconds. Then I closed that feeling away in the same internal location, where I stored everything else that needed to wait for its correct moment, and I opened my laptop and sent Margaret Chu a 3-word message. Notification confirmed delivered. She responded in 4 minutes with 2 words. Anticipated timeline holds. The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority inquiry was not, in itself, the primary instrument of what I had built. It was, in the architectural language I had been using internally for 6 years, a load-bearing wall. It provided structure and credibility and a regulatory framework that would force certain documentation into the open through processes that existed entirely outside my family's sphere of social influence. But the walls are not the building. The building was what Margaret Chu brought to my kitchen table on the third Friday of January. She arrived at 6 in the evening with a briefcase that I had never seen her carry before, a hard-sided case in a dark graphite material with combination locks on both latches, the kind of case that communicates not status but security. She accepted tea. She declined anything to eat. She set the case on my kitchen table and opened it with the specific economy of movement of a person who has prepared for this conversation in the same way I had prepared for every conversation in the past 6 years, which was completely. Inside the case were 3 manila folders, each one sealed with a red evidence tape strip across the closure, each one labeled in Margaret Chu's precise small handwriting with a category designation, a date range, and a case reference number. Beneath the folders was a bound document, approximately 60 pages, its cover page printed on her firm's letterhead, and beneath that, in a clear archival sleeve, a document I recognized immediately from its dimensions and the handwriting visible through the plastic. It was the original estate instrument, not a copy. The original, with Lawrence Beaumont's signature on the final page and my grandmother's signature on the page before that, in the rounded, deliberate penmanship of a woman who had learned to write in an era when handwriting was considered a reflection of character. I looked at it for a long moment without speaking. How? I said. Lawrence Beaumont maintained personal copies of all instruments executed during his final 18 months of practice, Margaret Chu said. A professional habit of 50 years. When I contacted him directly, through his personal attorney, and explained the specific nature of our concern, he provided access to his personal archive without hesitation. He's cooperating. He is cooperating, she said, with considerable energy, because what the record's request response revealed about the amendment execution suggests that his notarial seal was used on a document he did not personally witness or authorize. Which means the amendment to the instrument was not merely procedurally improper. It was executed using a fraudulent application of his professional credentials. She said this in the same register she used to discuss billing schedules and filing deadlines, which was the register of a person for whom the weight of a fact is independent of the emotion with which it is delivered. I sat with it for a moment. Forged, I said. The notarial application was fraudulent, she said carefully. Whether the specific signature is a forgery or whether the seal was misappropriated through another mechanism is something the forensic document examiner will determine. Her report is in the second folder. The forensic document examiner's name was Dr. Renata Sokolowski, and she held appointments at 2 universities and had provided expert testimony in 43 state and federal proceedings. A fact Margaret Chu mentioned not as decoration, but as structural information, the way an architect mentions the load rating of a beam. Dr. Sokolowski's report was 22 pages. Margaret Chu walked me through its conclusions with the patient clarity of someone translating a technical document for a person who is intelligent but not credentialed in the relevant specialty. The notarial seal on the amendment document had been applied to paper stock that was inconsistent with the paper stock used in Lawrence Beaumont's office during the period in which the seal was dated. The ink composition of the notarial signature, analyzed through a process called gas chromatography mass spectrometry, was inconsistent with the ink composition of the authenticated Beaumont signatures in the original instrument, which meant the signature had been produced with a different pen, or more precisely, a different ink formulation, than the one used for the original execution. The pressure distribution of the signature strokes, analyzed through a technique called electrostatic detection apparatus examination, was inconsistent with the natural pressure variation of an authenticated Beaumont signature sample. 3 independent forensic indicators, any one of which, Margaret Chu explained, would be sufficient to raise significant questions in a legal proceeding. All 3 together produced what Dr. Sokolowski had characterized in her report, in language that was careful precisely because it was so specific, as a high confidence determination of non-authentic execution. Non-authentic execution. I looked at the phrase in the report where Margaret Chu had placed a small tab marker. Non-authentic execution. The forensic language for a forgery executed by someone who had access to the seal and the document and the motive, and who had believed, reasonably enough given the circumstances, that the transit period chaos of an absorbed law practice and the quiet cooperation of a primary account holder would be sufficient to bury the evidence permanently. They had not accounted for a retired estate attorney's personal archive. They had not accounted for the fact that Lawrence Beaumont, who was 74 years old and living in a house in Scottsdale, Arizona, had spent 50 years believing that a man's professional seal was the material embodiment of his word, and that the fraudulent use of it was the kind of thing he would not, under any circumstances, decline to address. They had not accounted for Philip. They had not accounted for me. The third folder contained the financial trail. This was the work of a forensic accountant named Walter Osai, whom Margaret Chu had retained 4 months ago and whose findings she told me now with a small measured precision, waiting to present until they were complete enough to be presented all at once rather than in fragments that could be misread without their full context. Walter Osai's findings were presented in 31 pages of clear, organized financial analysis, with supporting transaction documentation attached as appendices. His conclusion was that the $137,000.44 that had been fraudulently redirected from my designated third of the estate instrument had not remained intact in the revised beneficiary structure. It had been moved. Over a period of 22 months following the fraudulent amendment, the funds had been transferred in increments, no single transfer exceeding $9,900, a threshold Walter Osai noted with the specific emphasis of a man who understood exactly why that threshold had been chosen, because it is the threshold below which certain mandatory federal reporting requirements are triggered, a practice known as structuring, which is itself a federal violation, regardless of the underlying source or destination of the funds. The funds had been transferred to an account jointly held by my parents and Denise. From that account, over the following 14 months, expenditures had been made. Walter Osei had identified and documented the specific expenditures attributable to the transferred funds with the particularity of a man who had spent 30 years tracing money through the specific gravity of its origin. Among the documented expenditures, the down payment on a vacation property in a lake community 3 hours north of Columbus, purchased 18 months after my grandmother's death, in the amount of $41,000. The renovation of Denise and Terrence's kitchen, for which a contractor had been paid $22,800 in a single payment from the joint account. And the cost of Denise's eldest daughter's first year at a private arts conservatory, a tuition payment of $38,500, made in 2 installments from the same account in the same fiscal year. I did not look away from the numbers while Margaret Chu presented them. I looked directly at them, at the clean columns of Walter Osei's accounting, and I felt the specific sensation of something becoming fully real that has existed in partial form for a long time. The way a photograph develops in a darkroom, detail emerging from blankness, until the image is complete and undeniable. $41,000 for the lake house down payment, $22,800 for Denise's kitchen, $38,500 for a tuition payment that my sister had accepted with the ease of a woman who believed she was entitled to it because, in the architecture that had been built without my knowledge, she was $137,000.44. My grandmother's third. Distributed with the careful invisibility of people who had convinced themselves that invisibility was the same as legitimacy. The structuring exposure, I said, is significant, Margaret Chu said. Walter's analysis identifies 24 separate transactions, each below the threshold, executed over 22 months. The pattern is not ambiguous. And the fraudulent instrument amendment is the predicate act. It is the predicate act, she confirmed. Which means that everything that follows from it, every transfer, every expenditure, carries the legal contamination of its origin. I looked at her across the table, across the 3 manila folders and the bound report and the archival sleeve containing my grandmother's signature on the original instrument. What's our position? I asked. Your position, Margaret Chu said, is considerably stronger than it was 6 months ago, and 6 months ago I told you it was workable. She permitted herself, then, the smallest version of a professional smile, the kind that lives at the corners of a person's expression rather than its center. We are ready to file, she said. The question is when? I told her I would let her know. I had specific timing in mind, and the timing was not random. My parents called me on a Sunday afternoon in mid-February, 2 weeks after Margaret Chu's kitchen table meeting, and my mother's voice had recovered its characteristic equilibrium, the signal I had been waiting for. Panic contracts. Equilibrium expands. My mother's equilibrium told me that she had reviewed the regulatory inquiry notification with someone, possibly an attorney of her own, possibly simply my father, and had concluded that the inquiry was a procedural inconvenience rather than a structural threat. That conclusion was incorrect, but I needed her to hold it for a while longer, and her phone call on that Sunday afternoon told me she had. We just wanted to check in, she said. See how you and the kids are doing. We're fine, I said. Busy, Marcus has a tournament coming up. A tournament, chess? Soccer, I said, a small pause during which I could hear the specific quality of my mother registering that she had not known this about her grandson. Well, she said, that's wonderful. We'd love to come watch sometime. I'll let you know the schedule, I said. I noted the call in the file. Date, duration, 7 minutes and 14 seconds, tone, content, the specific phrase, just wanted to check in, and what it communicated about her assessment of the current situation. Denise texted me the following Thursday. The text read, Hey Cal, hope things are good. I know things got a little weird at Christmas. I think we all just need to let it breathe for a bit and come back to things fresh. We miss the kids. I read the text. I noted it in the file. I did not respond immediately. After 48 hours, I responded with, Sounds good. Talk soon, 3 words that committed to nothing, confirmed nothing, and offered the exact amount of warmth required to keep the equilibrium intact. Denise sent a thumbs up emoji in response. I noted that in the file as well. The calls and texts continued over the following weeks with the rhythm of a family, carefully reestablishing a normal frequency of contact after a disruption, which is to say they came every 5 to 7 days, each one slightly warmer than the last, each one oriented toward the shared project of making things ordinary again. My father called once to tell me about a documentary he had watched that he thought Marcus might find interesting. My mother emailed a recipe she said she had clipped, which meant she had photographed it from a magazine, for a soup she thought Chloe might like. I responded to all of them. Briefly, warmly, with the exact temperature of a woman who has accepted that family is complicated and is choosing, graciously, to move forward. In mid March, my mother called to tell me about the anniversary party. My parents would be celebrating 45 years of marriage in April. They were hosting an event at the Harrowfield Country Club, the one with the waiting list and the dress code and my father's curated identity organized around its social gravity. Dinner for 60 guests. The family would all be there, of course. She hoped very much that I would bring the children. We want it to be a real family celebration, my mother said. Of course, I said, we wouldn't miss it. I ended the call. I made a note in the file. I noted the date, the venue, the guest count, the occasion. Then I called Margaret Chu. April, I said when she picked up. A 2-second pause. The country club event, she said. She had a comprehensive understanding of my family's social landscape by this point, built from 6 years of my documentation and several months of her own research. Yes, I said. That gives us 5 weeks, she said. Is that sufficient? It is more than sufficient, she said. I'll contact Walter, and I'll reach out to the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority contact to coordinate our filing timeline with their inquiry process so that our civil submission and their regulatory proceedings advance in parallel. And Lawrence Beaumont's materials? Already cataloged, she said. Dr. Sokolowski's report is finalized and certified. All 3 forensic exhibits are ready for submission. Then we proceed, I said. In the 3 weeks that followed, while my mother addressed invitations in her careful handwriting on cream-colored cardstock, and my father confirmed the menu with the club's event coordinator, and Denise texted me to ask what I was planning to wear so we could coordinate colors as the family women, because she said she was thinking of something in burgundy or navy, I spent my evenings at my kitchen table. I was not alone at the table. Philip came on the first evening with a bottle of something decent and the composed manner of a man who had made a decision 3 months ago and had not once second-guessed it. He sat across from me and looked at the materials I had organized across the table's surface and was quiet for a long moment. This is more than I knew, he said. Yes, I said. The kitchen renovation, he said, reading Walter Osai's summary. I was at that kitchen. Denise gave me a tour. She was very proud of the countertops. Italian marble, I said, installed 14 months after Grandma Leaner died. Philip looked at the number on the page, $22,800. He picked up his glass and took a slow drink. She used to make her pierogies on a laminate countertop, he said. Mom did, she never complained about it once. No, I said, she didn't. We did not speak for a moment. Outside, the March wind moved through the trees in the particular restless way of a season that hasn't yet decided what it's going to be. What do you need from me tonight? He asked. I need you to look at your statement, I said, and confirm that every detail is accurate as you remember it, not as you wish it had been, not as you think it should be, exactly as you remember it. He nodded. I slid the notarized statement across the table. He read it the way you read something important, not for speed but for each word in sequence, his lips not moving but his attention fully present on every line. When he finished, he looked up. It's accurate, he said. All of it? Every word, he said. I remember it exactly like that. Gerald said he'd sorted out the Aliner situation. That's the phrase he used. Sorted out, like she was a scheduling conflict. I noted the phrase in the file. I had noted it before. But I noted it again because repetition in documentation is not redundancy. It is corroboration. The physical organization of the evidence took 4 evenings. Philip was present for 2 of them. The children were asleep, and the house was quiet, and the kitchen table became a workspace that I moved through with the methodical attention of someone who understands that the physical order of materials is not administrative housekeeping but forensic architecture. Each manila envelope was a specific weight, the legal-sized ones with the clasp closure, and the reinforced gusset that allowed them to hold multiple documents without straining the seal. I had purchased them in a box of 50 from an office supply store, and they had the particular dry, clean smell of new paper products, a smell I had associated since childhood with the beginning of organized effort. I labeled each envelope by hand, in the same clear print I used for everything that would be seen by people other than myself, and I affixed a typed label over the handwritten one for clarity, because 2 layers of identification on materials that will be handled by multiple professionals in sequence is not excessive. It is the standard that protects the integrity of what is inside. The first envelope held Dr. Sokolowski's forensic document examination report, certified and signed, with the 4 authenticated signature samples she had used as her comparison baseline, and the 3 original instrument pages bearing Lawrence Beaumont's notarial seal, now enclosed in their own individual archival sleeves. The envelope was sealed with a red evidence tape strip across the closure, initialed in the lower right corner by both Margaret Chu and Dr. Sokolowski, and marked in the upper left with the case reference number. The second envelope held Walter Osai's financial analysis, with all appendices, including the transaction records for the 24 structured transfers and the three major expenditure documentation packages, the lake house closing documents, the kitchen renovation contractor invoice, the conservatory tuition payment confirmations. Each subdocument was separately tabbed and cross-referenced to the relevant section of Walter's analysis, so that any reader moving through the materials in sequence would encounter the supporting evidence at the precise moment the analysis described it. The third envelope held the communications. Every text message, exported from my phone with timestamp metadata intact, organized chronologically and annotated with a brief contextual note describing the family situation at the time of each communication. Every voicemail, transcribed verbatim, with the original audio file preserved on an encrypted external drive that sat in the upper left corner of my kitchen table throughout these 4 evenings like a small, quiet detonator. The fourth envelope held Philip's notarized statement. This one I handled with a particular care, because Philip's statement was the human element of the evidence, the thing that transformed the forensic and financial documentation from a technical record into a narrative that any reader could follow. It was 12 pages of ordinary language describing an extraordinary conversation, written in the plain, slightly informal cadence of a man who does not use legal language naturally, and who had therefore, as Margaret Chu had recognized immediately, produced something more credible than a polished professional account would have been. The fifth envelope held my grandmother's original materials, the letter from Lawrence Beaumont's personal archive, the estate summary document she had mailed to me, in its acid-free archival sleeve, the envelope it had arrived in, with the postmark and the handwritten note on the inside flap, separately sleeved to preserve the postmark's legibility, and the handwritten codicil, 3 paragraphs in my grandmother's rounded penmanship, specifying the gold Tiffany and Company Elsa Peretti bone cuff bracelet by name and by approximate value and by intended recipient, which was me, and which had spent the past several years on my sister's wrist. I sat with that envelope for longer than I sat with the others, not because I was uncertain about it, because it was the one that carried something beyond the legal framework, something that did not have a category designation or a case reference number, but was present in the materials nonetheless, in the handwriting of a woman who had known something was wrong and had done the only thing she could do about it, which was to make sure that one person knew the truth. So you know, she had written, I knew. Philip, sitting across the table on the fourth evening with the last of his coffee going cold in the mug, watched me seal the fifth envelope and asked, without preamble, "Are you ready?" I smoothed the red evidence tape across the closure of the envelope. I initialed the lower right corner. I placed it in the sequence with the other four. "Yes," I said. "Are you scared?" I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because it was not a rhetorical question. It was genuine inquiry from a man who cared about the answer. "No," I said. "I was scared for 6 years. This part is the part I've been working toward." He nodded. He picked up his mug and discovered the coffee was cold and set it back down. "Gerald is going to lose his mind," he said. "Gerald," I said, "is going to sit in a room full of 60 of his closest friends and professional associates and receive a legal notice simultaneously with an explanation of its contents, delivered in the presence of witnesses, at a private event where the guest list has been confirmed and the exits are not numerous." Philip was quiet for a moment, processing the architecture of this. "You're serving him at the party," he said. "Margaret Chu will have a process server at the venue," I said, "with the civil filing documents. Simultaneously, her office will submit our formal response to the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority inquiry, converting it from a complaint to a substantiated evidentiary submission. And I will be there, with my children, at the table my mother invited us to, as family." Philip looked at the 5 envelopes arranged on my kitchen table. He looked at the encrypted external drive in the upper left corner. He looked at me. "Cal," he said, and for the first time in our adult lives, when he called me that, it did not sound like a negotiation. "Country Club Board knows my father," I said. "His application for membership was sponsored by 3 current board members. His standing at the club is a significant component of how he understands himself in the world." I paused. "I have sent each of those 3 board members a sealed courtesy envelope containing a brief, factual summary of the pending proceedings and an offer to make the full documentation available for their review." Philip was very still. "When did you send those?" he asked. 10 days ago," I said. which means they have had sufficient time to decide how they feel about it before the anniversary dinner, but they have not yet had occasion to raise it because the occasion my father arranged for them to attend is the anniversary dinner itself. 60 guests, 3 compromised board sponsors, a process server with legal documents, a regulatory submission timed to the hour, my grandmother's gold ring on my right hand, my children at the table. And my parents, who had spent 3 months carefully rebuilding the ordinary frequency of a family that had cleared the air, who had sent a recipe for soup and asked about Marcus's tournament, and requested that the women coordinate their dress colors, who had selected the menu and confirmed the guest count and addressed the invitations in cream-colored cardstock with the same careful handwriting my mother applied to everything she wanted to get right. My parents, who were going to wake up on the morning of their 45th anniversary and put on their best clothes and drive to the club with the waiting list and the dress code, and greet their 60 guests and sit at the head of the table that had always been theirs. They had no idea the table had already been set for someone else. The morning of my parents' 45th anniversary was a Saturday in April, and it arrived with the particular quality of a day that does not know what it is about to be used for. I dressed my children carefully. Not formally, but with attention. Marcus wore a button-down collar shirt in a deep navy that I had pressed the evening before, and which he accepted without complaint, which told me he understood the gravity of the occasion in the wordless way that children absorb things from the adults they trust. Chloe wore a dress in a warm rust color with her hair pulled back in the style she preferred when she wanted to feel capable, which was her word for it. She said she wore her hair back when she wanted to feel capable. I had told them something true without telling them everything. I had told them that today might be a day they remembered for a long time. I had told them that whatever happened, they should stay close to me, stay quiet, and know that I had handled everything. Chloe had looked at me with the 9-year-old's precise calibration that I had watched develop over her entire life and said, "Did you fix it, Mom?" "Yes," I said. I fixed it. I wore the emerald green wrap blouse again. The same one I had worn to the December dinner, the one in the matte silk that moved with me. The same cognac leather heels polished to the same mirror surface. My grandmother's gold ring on my right hand. I drove to the Harrowfield Country Club at 6:45 in the evening, 15 minutes before the event was scheduled to begin. The club's main entrance was framed by 2 stone pillars with the club's emblem carved into each, and the parking lot had been arranged by an attendant service my parents had retained for the evening. I gave my keys to the attendant, a young man who accepted them with professional courtesy, and walked through the entrance with Chloe on my left and Marcus on my right. And I felt, as I walked through those doors, the particular sensation of a trajectory completing itself. The event room was the club's largest dining space, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows along one wall, overlooking the manicured green of the main course, and a ceiling with the kind of warm lighting that makes everything inside it look like a memory in progress. Round tables with white linens, centerpieces in white and cream, the good china on every place setting. 60 guests, arranged by my mother's careful seating plan, which I had of course not been consulted on. I found our table. We were placed at a table of 8, near the center of the room, neither at the head table where my parents and Denise and Terence sat, nor at the perimeter where distant acquaintances and the less socially significant guests were placed. We were positioned in the middle geography of the room, which in my mother's seating architecture communicated. Present, acknowledged, but not central. The old language. She had not been able to stop speaking it even for this evening. I sat down and helped Chloe with her napkin and told Marcus the bread rolls were on the right side of the table and watched the room fill. The 3 board members arrived within the first 12 minutes. I did not look at them directly. I did not need to. I knew where they were the way you know the position of a piece on a board without staring at it. My parents entered the room at 7 o'clock exactly, to a soft round of applause from the assembled guests. My mother was in a champagne-colored dress with a neckline that her personal shopper had helped her select and which was precisely calibrated to the occasion. My father was in a dark charcoal suit with a pocket square in a matching champagne that my mother had folded for him that morning. They looked, standing at the entrance to that room with the warm light catching them, like a couple who had earned their place at the center of the table. They moved through the room with the ease of people entirely certain of their terrain. My mother embraced guests. My father shook hands and made the particular laugh that was his social register, warm and projected, designed to fill the space around it. Denise and Terence arrived 3 minutes behind them and completed the picture, a family in their best presentation, in their best setting, on the evening that was supposed to confirm everything they believed about themselves. My mother found my eyes across the room, early in the arrival sequence. She smiled at me. It was a genuine smile, or the closest version of genuine she produced in public, the smile of a woman who believed the house was in order. I smiled back. The small, steady smile. The one that said nothing except that I was present. Dinner was served at 7:30. The menu was as my mother had specified: a first course of composed salad, an entree of beef tenderloin with roasted accompaniments, and a dessert course that would be paired with the anniversary cake. The wine was good. The service was precise. Everything was, as my mother had designed it to be, correct. I ate my first course. I answered the conversation of the couple seated next to us, a long-standing family friend and his wife who asked politely about my work in Marcus's school and made the appropriate sounds when Chloe told them about the spring play she had been cast in. I was warm, present, and entirely unremarkable, which was exactly what I needed to be. At 8:12 in the evening, during the interval between the first course and the entree, my mother stood and touched her glass with a small spoon. The room settled. She spoke for 4 minutes about 45 years of marriage and family, and the particular kind of love that is built through shared time rather than grand gesture. It was a well-constructed speech. She had clearly written it and likely delivered it to herself in the bathroom mirror more than once. There were 2 moments of genuine warmth in it, and the rest was the architecture of warmth, which is a different thing, but is often sufficient for an audience that is not watching carefully. When she sat down, my father stood. His speech was shorter and better, 4 sentences. He said that 45 years had taught him one thing above all others, which was that the most important decisions you make are not the ones you deliberate over, but the ones you make before you know enough to be afraid. He said my mother had been that kind of decision. He raised his glass. 60 people raised their glasses. I raised mine. Chloe raised her water glass. Marcus raised his. And then Denise stood. She had not been on the program, which told me this was improvised, or staged to appear improvised, which with Denise were often the same thing. She was wearing the burgundy she had texted me about, the gold earrings that fell to her collarbone. And on her left wrist, visible in the warm light of the room as she raised her own glass, was the gold Tiffany and Company Elsa Peretti bone cuff bracelet that my grandmother had specified in her handwritten codicil, and that my sister had worn to my father's 65th birthday party, and had been complaining about its clasp being slightly loose for the past 6 months in my mother's presence. A detail I knew because Philip had mentioned it at Christmas with the particular unconscious reporting instinct of a man who does not always know what he is observing, but observes it accurately. She spoke about family. She spoke about her parents being the foundation of everything she had built. She said, with the comfortable laugh of a woman entirely certain of her terrain, that she was proud to stand here as the daughter they had raised, in the family they had built, surrounded by the people who knew what this family truly was. The room applauded. I looked at the bracelet on her wrist. $2,140. My grandmother's name in a handwritten codicil. 3 years on my sister's wrist and counting. I placed my right hand flat on the table, feeling the linen, feeling the thin weight of my grandmother's gold ring, and I observed the room with the precision of someone for whom this moment had existed, in preparation if not in actuality, for 6 years. The process server entered the room at 8:31. He was a man I had never met, retained by Margaret Chu from a firm she used specifically for high-stakes service requirements, meaning events where the professionalism of the delivery was as important as the legal function of it. He was dressed appropriately for the venue, which was Margaret Chu's instruction, and he moved through the room with the quiet directness of someone who knows exactly where he is going and does not require assistance getting there. He approached the head table. He asked quietly whether he was speaking to Gerald Vane. My father, who had the particular radar of a man who has spent a career in municipal finance and knows that a certain type of quiet question at a certain type of occasion is never a routine inquiry, looked at the man with a shift in his expression that I observed from the center of the room as the first crack in the evening's architecture. He confirmed his name. The process server placed the documents on the table in front of my father with the professional precision of someone completing a function, said the required words clearly enough to be heard by the people immediately adjacent to the head table, which included the two closest board members, and stepped back. The room had not stopped. Most people were still in conversation, still in the warm, ambient noise of a dinner party at its comfortable midpoint. But at the head table, a stillness had occurred that was spreading outward in a radius, the way a stone dropped in still water sends its rings to every edge eventually. My father looked at the documents. My mother looked at my father. Denise looked at the process server, who had already turned and was moving toward the exit with the uninterested efficiency of a man who has completed his task. And then my mother looked across the room and found me. I was already standing. I had timed the standing to coincide with the moment she found me, because the geometry of that eye contact was the only theatrical element I had permitted myself in the entire architecture of this evening. Everything else was documentation and legal process and forensic evidence. This one moment was for her. For the specific experience of looking across a room full of 60 people and understanding, in a single instant, that the woman she had seated nearest the kitchen for 6 years had known exactly where to stand. I walked to the head table. Chloe and Marcus remained at ours. I had arranged for the couple next to us to keep an eye on them, framed as a brief table errand, and they had agreed with the ease of people who did not know they were part of anything. I sat down in the empty chair at the end of the head table, the chair that had been placed for a guest who had declined at the last minute, a detail I had known because my mother had mentioned it when she called to confirm our attendance. I sat with the posture of a woman who is entirely at ease. My father was still looking at the documents. His hands on the table on either side of the envelope were very still. Gerald, I said, my voice was low enough that it did not carry beyond the head table. You should probably look at the summary page first. It will give you the most efficient overview. What is this? He said, not to me, not quite to anyone. The question of a man who has heard something that his internal architecture cannot immediately process. It is a civil filing, I said, in the matter of the fraudulent amendment to Grandmother Aliner's estate instrument. The amendment executed 9 weeks after her death, during the transfer period of Attorney Beaumont's client files, bearing a notarial seal that Dr. Renata Sokolowski has determined with high confidence to be non-authentically executed. The specific forensic language. I used it deliberately, not because it would mean everything to him in this moment, but because the specificity of it communicated something that vague language cannot, that I knew exactly what had been done. My mother said my name, the four-syllable version, the full version she used for serious occasions. Mom, I said, with a gentleness that I felt and did not perform, because I had decided months ago that I would not perform anything in this moment. I know you understand what's happening. You've had the regulatory inquiry letter since January. You've had 3 months to prepare for this. You sent those letters, Denise said. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before, because it was an expression produced by a situation she had not previously experienced, which was the experience of consequence. I sent the courtesy envelopes to the board members. Yes, I said, because they deserved the opportunity to understand the situation before this evening rather than during it. I looked at the bracelet on her wrist. She followed my eyes. Then she looked back at me, and in that sequence of looking, I watched her understand something. The codicil, I said quietly, specified the Tiffany and Company Elsa Peretti bone cuff, your mother's own handwriting, valued at $2,140 in the original estate summary. The summary she mailed directly to me, the one that has been in an acid-free archival sleeve in my home office for 6 years. Denise's left hand moved, a small involuntary contraction toward her right hand, the beginning of a gesture she stopped before it completed. The estate summary document, I continued, is the fourth item in the fifth exhibit envelope of our filing package. Along with the original codicil, Lawrence Beaumont's archive copy of the instrument, and the envelope my grandmother used to mail the summary to me, postmark intact, with her note on the inside flap. So you know, 2 words. My mother's champagne-colored dress had the quality, in the warm light of the room, of something very carefully chosen for a different kind of evening. The financial analysis, I said, covers 24 structured transfers totaling $137,000.44, each transfer individually below the federal reporting threshold. The pattern is documented in Walter Osai's report, which is Exhibit 2. He identifies 3 primary expenditure categories. I looked at Denise. The lake house down payment, your kitchen renovation, and the first year of conservatory tuition. I said the numbers, all 3 of them, fully in words as I had written them as they appeared in Walter Osai's 31 pages of clean, organized, cross-referenced financial analysis. I said them at the low, clear register of a woman delivering a report rather than an accusation, because the distinction matters and I had never lost sight of it. $41,000, $22,800, $38,500. My father's hands on the table were no longer still. Callista. His voice had the quality of something that is trying to reconstruct its authority and finding the material insufficient. This is a misunderstanding of how the instrument worked. Lawrence handled everything properly. We simply made an administrative adjustment that we had full authority to make. Lawrence Beaumont, I said, is cooperating fully with our legal team. He provided his personal archive copy of the original instrument, because he discovered that his notarial seal had been applied to the amendment document without his knowledge or participation. He's 74 years old, and he takes the professional integrity of his seal very seriously. My father looked at the documents in front of him. You can't, Denise said and stopped. I can't what? I asked. She did not complete the sentence, because there was no completion available to her. The sentence had started from a position of assumed limitation that no longer had any structural support. Guess they didn't earn one, I said. I said it quietly. In the exact register she had used at Thanksgiving, and again at the December dinner, the comfortable register of someone entirely certain of their terrain. That's what you said, at Thanksgiving and again in December. I want you to know that I documented both instances. I paused. Everything you said to me at that December dinner is in Exhibit 3. Every text message you sent me in the 3 months following it is in Exhibit 3. Every phone call, time-stamped and transcribed. I looked at my mother. Everything you said to me at Thanksgiving is in Exhibit 3, the specific phrasing, the orchestration of the gift presentation, the theatrical ceremony, all of it documented contemporaneously, which in legal proceedings means it was recorded at the time of occurrence rather than reconstructed from memory afterward. My mother placed her hand on the table in front of her. She placed it the way you place something down when you need to confirm that something solid exists beneath you. We're family, she said. It was the only thing she had left to say, and she knew it, and I knew it, and I believe she knew that I knew it. Yes, I said, we are. And grandmother Alina was family too. She knew what you were planning to do with her estate. She knew it while she was alive. And she did the only thing she could do about it, which was to make sure I had documentation before you could take it from me. I touched my grandmother's ring with my thumb, a small, private gesture that no one at the table could read. I'm going to keep fighting for what she intended. Not because of the money, though $137,000.44 is a meaningful sum that my children have a legal interest in, but because she asked me to know, and I know, and now the appropriate authorities know as well. I stood up from the chair. Enjoy the rest of your dinner, I said. The tenderloin is very good. I walked back to my table. I sat down next to Chloe, who looked at me with her calibrating gaze, and I put my arm around her briefly, and she leaned against me for exactly 3 seconds before sitting back up straight, which is the amount of comfort she accepts in public. All good? Marcus asked, without looking up from the bread roll he was examining. All good, I said. The fallout did not happen in the room. It happened in the days that followed, with the quiet, institutional inevitability of a process that has been set in motion by people whose professional function is to be thorough. The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority's formal inquiry, now substantiated by our evidentiary submission, moved to the next procedural phase within 11 days of the anniversary dinner. My father received a formal notification at his home address requiring his written response to specific documented findings within 30 days. The notification named him by his full name and described the nature of the inquiry in language that was not designed for privacy. The country club board requested a meeting with my father within the week. I do not know what was said in that meeting, because I was not there and it was not my business to be. What I know is that my father's board membership was placed under administrative review, a status that was communicated to him in a letter, and that his name was removed from the active membership directory pending the review's conclusion. Denise's husband Terrence worked in financial services. The compliance department of his firm received, through a separate channel entirely, notification of the pending civil proceedings in which his wife was named as a beneficiary of funds identified in a forensic accounting analysis. His firm's own compliance procedures required a formal review of any employee adjacent to an active financial misconduct proceeding. Terrence was placed on administrative leave pending that review within 3 weeks of the anniversary dinner. The lake house was mortgaged. When my father's financial exposure became visible to the institution that held that mortgage, and when the institution's own compliance procedures were triggered by the connection between the property and the funds identified in our civil filing, the institution requested accelerated documentation of the loan's asset basis. This produced a sequence of events that I did not orchestrate and did not need to orchestrate, because that is the nature of a well-constructed legal proceeding. It moves on its own momentum once it has been properly set in motion. My mother called me on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner. I let it ring. She called again. I let it ring. She left a voicemail. It was 11 minutes and 9 seconds, 3 seconds shorter than the first one she had left after Thanksgiving, which I noted in the file as a data point regarding the trajectory of her composure. She said things I had waited for her to say for 6 years. She said she was sorry. She said she loved me and the children. She said she knew things had not been fair, and she said this with the specific phrasing of a woman who is conceding minimum necessary ground while protecting maximum remaining territory, which is a recognizable technique and one that I had at this point no remaining patience for. She said near the end that she hoped we could find a way to keep the family together. The family together. The phrase that means, let us return to the previous arrangement, the one in which the definition of family included your silence and your presence in the left seat nearest the kitchen and your children's empty hands at Christmas. I did not call her back. Denise texted me. She did not call. Texting for Denise was the register she used when she wanted the negotiating distance that voice contact does not provide. The text said, Cal, I know things are bad right now. I want you to know I'm sorry. I think we let mom and dad drive some decisions that weren't right. I want to fix things with you if you'll let me. I read the text. I noted it in the file. I did not respond. On the Friday of that same week, Philip took me to dinner at a restaurant we had been to once before, a place with good food and the ambient noise level that allows a real conversation to occur without being overheard. He ordered the fish. I ordered the lamb. We ate and talked about things that had nothing to do with estate instruments or forensic accountants or 45-year anniversaries, and it was the best dinner I had eaten in longer than I could easily account for. At the end of the evening, when we were waiting for the check, he looked at me across the table. How are you actually? He said. I thought about the question. Lighter, I said. He nodded. He seemed to understand this completely. She would have been pleased, he said. He meant my grandmother. I think so, I said. She was a practical woman. She would have appreciated the acid-free sleeves. Philip laughed, the too loud laugh that made him inconvenient in certain rooms and entirely necessary in others. And I laughed with him, and the check came, and we split it evenly. And I drove home through the spring evening to my children and my house and my life, which was the same life it had been before the anniversary dinner, except that it was no longer being conducted in the gravity of a story that someone else was telling about me. That is the difference that is hardest to describe to people who have not experienced it. 6 months later, it was October, and the settlement had been reached and the funds had been returned, and the regulatory matter was in its later procedural stages, and the lake house had been sold. And I was sitting in a chair on the small balcony of a hotel room in a city I had always wanted to visit, with a cup of coffee that was better than any coffee I had made in my own kitchen in recent memory, watching the morning light move across the buildings below me. I had taken my children here for a long weekend. 3 days, just the three of us, in a city with good food and museums they had chosen themselves, and a hotel with a rooftop garden where Chloe had spent 40 minutes examining every plant while Marcus read in a chair nearby, with the focused serenity of a boy who is exactly where he wants to be. I sat on the balcony with the coffee and the light and the specific silence that belongs to early mornings in places that are not yet fully awake, and I thought about what I would say if someone asked me what I had learned. Not what had happened, what I had learned, because they are different questions and they produce different answers. The first truth is about systems. What my family operated was not a collection of individual cruelties, it was a system. A system has internal logic, consistent rules, and a structure that serves the people at its center. The people at the periphery of a system like that are not there by accident. They are positioned there intentionally, because the system requires them in that position to function. Understanding this distinction between individual cruelty and systemic positioning was the thing that changed my entire approach. When you understand that you are dealing with a system, you stop trying to fix individual incidents. You stop hoping that the right conversation will change things, that the right apology will restructure the dynamic, that the right moment of recognition from the person who has hurt you will repair what has been done. Because systems do not change through individual conversations. They change through structural intervention, which means documentation, legal recourse, financial accountability, and the withdrawal of your participation from the system itself. The second truth is about silence. I spent 6 years being quiet in rooms where I should have spoken, and then I spent 6 more years being strategically quiet while I built what I needed to build. And the distinction between those two silences is the distinction between surrender and preparation. My family mistook one for the other. That mistake was their most consequential error, and they made it because they had a fixed image of who I was that they were unwilling to revise. People who depend on your compliance in order to maintain their position will almost always misread your silence as compliance. They cannot afford to read it as anything else. This is information. This is structural intelligence about the nature of what you are dealing with. When the person who has harmed you consistently misreads your composure as defeat, you understand that their perception of you is not based on observation but on need. And need is not reliable. Need will make them careless. Need made my family careless for long enough to do precisely what they did. The third truth is about evidence. People who are being treated unfairly often feel the urgency to confront immediately, to name what is happening in the moment, to demand acknowledgement from the people who are causing the harm. I understand that urgency. I felt it every time I sat in the left seat nearest the kitchen and served the meal and watched my children receive the specific message that they were less than. But confrontation without documentation is testimony. And testimony, in the systems I have described, is always subject to revision by the people who have the social authority to revise it. My family would have revised my confrontation into evidence of my instability, my oversensitivity, my failure to understand how family works. They had done it before. They would have done it again. Documentation is different. Documentation is not testimony, it is record. It cannot be revised by the people who are the subject of it because it exists independently of their interpretation. The voicemail is the voicemail. The transaction record is the transaction record. The forensic examiner's report is the forensic examiner's report. Build your record before you move. Build it carefully. Build it with professional support if you can access it. And understand that the building of it is not a failure to act. It is the most consequential action available to you. The fourth truth is about the cost of peace. People will tell you that cutting off family, or reducing contact, or withdrawing your cooperation from a system that has harmed you is a drastic measure. They will tell you that family is complicated, and everyone makes mistakes and relationships require compromise. These things are true in healthy relational systems. They are not true in systems that have been deliberately constructed to benefit certain members at the expense of others. My children did not receive gifts at Thanksgiving because a system had decided they did not deserve them. My grandmother's estate was fraudulently amended because a system had decided I did not deserve my share of it. These were not misunderstandings. They were not accidents. They were the logical outputs of a system functioning exactly as it was designed to function. The cost of maintaining peace within a system like that is not compromise. It is your children watching themselves be measured and found wanting. It is your grandmother's wishes being overridden by people who trusted that you would not be paying attention. It is your own life, conducted in the gravity of a story that someone else is telling about you. That cost is too high. It was always too high. I was simply the last to understand this clearly enough to act on it. The fifth truth is about what you are owed. You are not owed an apology from people who have harmed you. You may want one. It may feel like the appropriate conclusion to an experience of injustice. But the apology, if it comes, will come from the version of them that exists after consequence has arrived, the version that is sorry because the harm has been exposed rather than because the harm was wrong. Those are not the same apology, and they do not function the same way in the economy of your healing. What you are owed is the use of every legal, ethical, and institutional mechanism available to address genuine wrongdoing. You are owed the competent professional support to understand what those mechanisms are. You are owed the time to build your case properly. You are owed the right to remove yourself and your children from a system that has decided your worth is conditional. And you are owed the knowledge that composure is not weakness. That documentation is not pettiness. That the slow, meticulous, unglamorous work of building a case across 6 years of dinners and holidays and left seat nearest the kitchen is not bitterness. It is the architecture of your own survival, built by a woman who understood that the most powerful thing she could do in a room full of people who had underestimated her was to let them keep doing it for exactly as long as she needed them to. My coffee was cool now, and the city below was fully awake, and inside the hotel room I could hear the particular sound of Marcus moving around, the footsteps of a boy who wakes up ready for the day to begin. In a few minutes I would go inside and we would have breakfast together, the three of us, and Chloe would ask about the museum schedule and Marcus would have opinions about lunch. And the day would be the day it was going to be, which was ours, completely and without qualification, with no left seat by the kitchen and no orchestrated hierarchy of boxes and no comfortable laugh cutting through the air. I held my grandmother's ring for a moment in the morning light. Then I went inside to my children. Keep your boundaries strong, guard your peace, and I will see you in the next.